I started working, well, the entire time I was working directly for Crescent Resources, a referral through another colleague of mine onto the project before Crescent Resources had the lease with EPA. So Crescent Resources hired me to do an evaluation of the project as designed, as it was just going out to bid, to see what would it take to meet the requirements of the EPA's SFO, solicitation for offers, that had just come out or was just about to come out, which is something they'd been waiting for quite some time, because they had heard that it was going to be forthcoming in some fashion. So once it was released, there was a rather intensive lead feasibility study done on the project, which I coordinated, but it certainly involved a number of other team members, including at the time the property manager that was assigned at the time of the SFO, et cetera. So there was an extensive effort done to figure out what was the project already scoring as design, and what was the delta, what was needed to achieve certain lead prerequisites perhaps and lead credits to attain the silver certification that would be required by the SFO, along with what all the costs would be associated with that. Originally it was okay. There were a few things. Certainly the entire commissioning process would have been extra. They already had some green criteria imposed upon them by Arlington County, and this is kind of Potomac Yard 1 and 2 Potomac Yard came in an interesting time in Arlington County's history, because they have been progressively raising the bar on their requirements of the private sector when there are site plan approval processes and rezoning processes involved. So because Virginia is a by right state, it's only when there is a rezoning or site plan approval process that that gives the opportunity to leverage that process to insert green building requirements. And so there were certain things like a partial green roof was already part of the design. There were a number of alternative transportation requirements that were already based on the site plan conditions negotiated with the county. So the mechanical system as it was needed to be enhanced in order to achieve the target level of performance, which at the time was 20% over the 1999 version of ASHRAE 90.1. It's starting to sound like ancient lead history because all the standards have evolved since. Yeah, I was your basic lead coordinator of most things. I myself, by my training, am an architect, and so I tend to focus on the building material, indoor environmental quality, to some extent the water efficiency. I tend to focus less on the mechanical electrical systems, not being an MEP engineer myself. So I was involved from the beginning through all of the initial feasibility. Once the decision was made to award the lease to Crescent Resources, because they were competing for it, I was then involved in a mad 30-day process to implement all of the redesign elements that were necessary in order to score the points. So that was an intensive effort that I was deeply involved with. And then from that point forward, it was a matter of coordinating the team and tracking everything to make sure that all of the design revisions or the design criteria that related to LEED were upheld throughout the entire process. Because almost as soon as we finished that 30-day redesign process, then the contract for construction was awarded shortly thereafter, and the rubber met the road at that point. It was a very complicated team process. One of the pieces, too, and another set of criteria that was in the SFO had to do with recovered materials, and that was a very near and dear issue to the EPA, particularly because one of the main offices of the EPA that is housed here is in fact the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. So they are the people who wrote the federal government's recovered material criteria several years prior. And so that was a very important point for them. And multiple meetings were held, for example, about the relative content of ground granulated blast furnace slag, which is a post-industrial material for use in the concrete mixture, and what percent would be used in the winter and what percent would be used in the summer, and all of that sort of thing was actually the subject of several meetings. So that was a complicating factor, but it was just a very large team as well. And so on the tenant side of the table, you had a number of GSA folks, a number of EPA folks. There were lawyers involved on both sides of the table. You had the developer, you had a number of general contractor folks from Davis Construction, the MEP engineer. The meetings typically were very large. So, and it was, as was previously mentioned, it was a very high-profile project for all of the team members, so everybody sort of put their A team onto the project. As a green building consultant and someone who's really dedicated my whole career to green building, my goals were that everything that was environmentally achievable and realistically achievable on the project be achieved. Now, the developer's requirement, as stipulated in the lease, was for a LEED silver building, essentially, although in this case we divided it up into two different certifications, one for building 1 and one for building 2, though we could have done it all together as one project. But in any case, the requirement was for LEED silver, but we well exceeded that, as you know, by going well above and beyond the level of LEED gold. I wouldn't say we were close to platinum, but we were well over LEED gold in the case of both building certifications. And part of the reason for that was to have the absolute greatest level of assurance that the developer could secure to establish that LEED silver as a deal breaker. So essentially one of their drivers was written into their lease because they would have incurred a 10% rent penalty over all 450-ish thousand square feet over the 10-year life of the lease had they not achieved LEED silver. So that was a heck of a driver for them, and so that was therefore something that made them want to make sure that all of the team members were functioning at their highest level of LEED performance, and that was my job as the LEED coordinator to make sure that that happened, that nothing got dropped at any point in the process. We have a very strong driver of the federal sort of green lease program, if you will, where they are in increasing numbers putting those requirements into the lease negotiations and into the SFO, the solicitation for offers. And so you have quite a number, especially in downtown DC, but also in the surrounding areas like Arlington, you have an increasing number of speculative office buildings that, as a matter of course, these days are being built to at least LEED certified level, but usually silver or gold level certification, because that sort of pre-qualifies them, in a sense, for obtaining federal tenants. There certainly is a big contribution made in this area also by state and local governments, and the District of Columbia and Montgomery County, Maryland, Arlington County, Prince George's County have been implementing requirements for their own buildings, in particular public schools and rec centers and all that sort of thing. But Arlington had long ago gone above and beyond by placing certain requirements upon the private sector. And so they've just been sort of steadily increasing the level of those requirements over time. In fact, one of the other things that made this project very unique was that in addition to the LEED requirements, in addition to the requirement for silver certification and a set of preferred and expected points that the EPA had put in the lease, there were a number of criteria that were also included in the lease that were aside from LEED. and in some cases slightly conflicted with LEED. And so this was a very multi-layered green building exercise. I already mentioned the Arlington County requirements. That included, again, I mentioned alternative transportation, and there was the partial green roof on the connector building. But the SFO included requirements for low-emitting materials that had different categories than the LEED categories. So for each product, you had to kind of evaluate, okay, does it fit in this category over here and that category over there, and which one is the more stringent requirement, and that's the one we have to use. So there was that, but there were also some additional IAQ-related requirements. I think in some cases the level of filtration required was even more stringent than LEED required, and those sort of things had to be looked at side by side and overlaid in order to always make sure you're meeting both criteria simultaneously. Our biggest resource is our own internal experience, because much as this was, for some project team members, their first or perhaps their second, but an early LEED project for them, we had done several by the time we began Potomac Yard, and so there was a lot of anecdotal information that we had internally about credit interpretations, about material and system availability, market availability of, for example, how easy is it in 2004 or whatever it was when construction began to find low VOC adhesives for every application needed, and so we had collected a lot of information in-house that really served us as a resource for the project itself. Certainly the USGBC credit interpretations became a big part of our process, because there were always even though it was an office building and LEED was written for office buildings, there was always some amount of interpretation that had to be done. We also used, for product research, I always go to Building Green's online suite, the Green Spec directory that's online, because they keep that very current and very, very thorough. So that's a very reliable source for that sort of thing. We have a number of tools at our disposal, some of which USGBC has provided us and some of which we've created ourselves. So our basic tool is what we call a LEED tracking tool, and it's been traditionally just an Excel file, but we've manipulated Excel to its fullest advantage to do the greatest number of things that we can do with it to track different types of data with that. So that has tended to be our central organizing tool, although we're considering evolving that into something web-based in the future. But LEED Online for the LEED EB project was a very big help as well, because we were able to just upload documentation. The LEED NC process, which again, talking ancient LEED history, was NC version 2.1 for both Building 1 and Building 2. That was a binder submittal, so we were photocopying and we were typing up labels for the binder tabs and all that sort of thing. So that, that paper-based system was a little more cumbersome, of course, than it became with LEED Online. So LEED Online was very helpful with the EB process. It still had a few quirks about it and things that we, even gave feedback during the process of, it'd be really great if it could do this. And one of the things that was a bit challenging was the documentation in LEED EB. There just simply hadn't been as many LEED EB projects done by any stretch as LEED NC projects at that time. And so there were a few things in the reference guide that didn't quite match what the LEED Online template said. And so we had to sort of find the best of both worlds as we went along. Based on the site plan, the approved design of the building overall, sort of the elevation that was approved with the site plan process, there's a sort of semi-roof over a lot of the mechanical equipment on the roof, and that is a metal structure, and the product of choice came with pre-finished metal panels, but the coating for those metal panels was tested for, was it emissivity, I think, with a testing methodology that was not the one referenced by the LEED credit, and it wasn't accepted, and credit ruling after credit ruling confirmed that. So in fact, this white metal roof system that was affordable and reliable and the right choice for the product had to then be field coated with another layer of coating that had been tested with an approved testing methodology. So that was, a hindrance on that particular credit, but we were able to have that done, and we did earn that credit on both buildings. Another challenging credit, and one which we ended up withdrawing from the submission, was the light pollution reduction credit. And because Arlington County has a standard light fixture for use throughout the county, which is an acorn type fixture, even if it has refractors on the inside of the fixture, it still doesn't meet the full cutoff criteria of that version of LEED. And so even though Arlington County wants as many projects as possible to meet the LEED criteria, they have a little bit of a stumbling block with their own lighting requirements. The electric vehicle charging stations were something that I advocated against because I knew that by that point in time, no one was using plug-in electrical vehicles. But that was another case where the developer wanted to make sure that we earned as many extra LEED points as possible so that there was no question about getting LEED silver. I was sort of saying, well, let's spend the money on something else that has a more tangible environmental benefit. But the interesting thing is that now we're in the era of the possibility, anyhow, of plug-in hybrid vehicles. And so that technology that really became obsolete maybe has a renaissance with the opportunity for plug-in hybrids. Now, every time I have come to this parking lot, because I park today, the very interesting thing for me, because most of the occupants of these two buildings and therefore the garages are EPA staff, the thing that always strikes me is how empty the parking structure is compared to every other parking structure in the entire metropolitan DC area, because they maximize the use of bicycle commuting. There's a shuttle that goes straight from the Crystal City Metro to here. There are buses that come around here, and they do carpooling. And so essentially there's a relatively low percent of the garage users who come in a single occupancy vehicle, and that's great. I was able to make some suggestions for some bio-based materials, some rapidly renewable and bio-based materials that were in use in some of the millwork, and that allowed, because the interior design had not been done by the time we were beginning the project. It was sort of two separate packages, and the design intent drawings for that were done by Metropolitan Architects and Planners, and Davis Carter Scott did the Architect of Records documents for that. And so I worked with both firms to kind of be creative about material selection, and we put a lot of thought and a lot of research into the carpet selection. And the carpet for interior designers is sort of the place you start. So once you've selected the carpet, that drives every other interior design decision that you make. So that was an important one. Well, because it's a large-scale project, there are certain things like FSC certified wood that might be affordable for a larger office building where, for example, there's not a whole lot of wood relatively used in the base building anyway. So that's an opportunity that was a good one for a large project like this. But just to see construction waste recycling done at its very best, to see indoor air quality management done to its very best during construction, those were things that were important to me to see carried out. And on both of those, we were very fortunate to have a contractor. The assistant project manager was essentially functioning as the lead coordinator, and she did a great job of being extremely thorough with submittals and documentation and making sure that all of the subs understood exactly what they needed to do. And almost nothing came into my hands to review that hadn't already been comprehensively reviewed by her. So there was almost nothing in the construction phase that I caught that was an error. It was similar to what was a very short design process for my involvement, the sort of 30-day redesign push. So there were a number of remaining issues from that needed to be addressed. We sort of dealt with the big ticket, the biggest impact issues. So in the early stage of construction, as is common in many projects, you're still sort of working out your final design issues. So there was a lot of that, but there was a lot of just assurance, quality control in the process. Things would pass across my desk to be sort of blessed for lead credit worthiness. And as I mentioned, the lead coordinator on the contractor side had all of the submittals that they would process, and they did a very good job in this case of reviewing things before they came to me. But basically every submittal that had the potential for having either a lead green building implication or an EPA SFO green requirement implication, that they all crossed my desk for review. And so that was a heavy role during the construction process. And because this was the older version of LEED, which was more binder based and more documentation had to be submitted, there was just sort of a lot of collection of information. Again, the contractor did a great job with collecting things on their end, and they actually produced sort of record sets of submittal binders that were just about the construction submittals in case we ever needed to go back to anything. But because this was pre-LEED online, this was also pre the design phase submission being separated from the construction phase submission. And now we do that on almost every project because we can. But at that time, the entire submission was at the end of construction. So you sort of spent the whole construction phase working towards that event at the very end of the project of submitting the entire package, and then then the back and forth auditing process, whatever, and hoping things go smoothly. Yeah. My role, and this is typical for the LEED projects that we work on, we're really not site inspectors. So we came to the job site as far as that's where the meetings were held in the office the small office building that was right next door to the job site. But I didn't do a walkthrough per se of the building at any time. There were certain things that the approval process was all done in a paper fashion, and so that was, for example, all of the submitted products, all the construction phase submittals. That was the way in which I ensured that the right thing had been approved. Now, does that say that I'm standing there on the job site, monitoring as to whether, every single can of adhesive or sealant or tube of sealant or can of paint that walks onto the job site is exactly as it was approved? No, that's typically not the lead coordinator's job on the consultant side, but that was part of the contractor's general quality assurance. And so if they saw something that wasn't what had been approved through the submittal process, then they immediately kind of removed it from the site and had something else brought in. Then there are certain things like the Indoor Air Quality Management Plan, which is a construction process credit that was monitored by Davis Construction, but one of the ways in which I verified it was by the submission of digital photos of the protective measures that were done on the site. And generally speaking, people take more photos than the minimum needed because you want to make sure you have an example of everything and some additional backup data, and they're just digital, so they're free. But in any case, that was another big part of the project. And I will say that that was another area in which the EPA got very involved, because there were certain things that were just, understood that the contractor is going to handle this. And then there were other things that the EPA as tenant, but as the EPA, and having had indoor air quality problems in previous buildings, including headquarters buildings in DC, they wanted to make sure that they were not going to have any indoor air quality problems in this building. So the construction indoor air quality management plan went back and forth between the contractor and the EPA and my desk. I mean, it went sort of not in circles, but it went back and forth probably a half a dozen times before it was final. And that's a higher level of scrutiny than I've seen on any project. Something that astonishes me sometimes when I hear that LEED projects have, whether it's an in-house coordinator or a separate consultant like we are, that they stop the consulting as soon as the design's done, because that's just the beginning in a sense. And I don't know how the quality assurance is completely done. Of course, if you're lucky to have a good solid coordinator like Davis Construction's person was, then that's, you know, a large part of the way there. But you definitely still have to have some kind of outside non-construction personnel review of what's going on to make sure that things are taking place, not just that they're being done correctly, but that the sequence of things is correct. Materials recycling, for example, you want to make sure that if you're going to have separate bins for things, that you're doing that intelligently, as far as, okay, in the beginning of the project is not when you're going to have your carpet, and at the end of the project is not when you're going to have your structural steel. So getting the sequence of what you're collecting when correct is another thing that we review for, and it's something that takes, you know, a fair amount of attention to detail. And I do think it's very important that somebody responsible for coordinating the lead credits be, you know, present from soup to nuts in the project and doesn't walk away as soon as the bids are in. All kinds of things can change during the construction process, and, you know, substitutions. I mean, the price of materials changes every day, and sometimes you find that something has to be substituted just because the price became outlandish by the time you sent it out to bid, where it wasn't like that 6 months prior or whatever. Market availability of green products changes all the time, and so you have to be able to find, you know, to sort of think on your feet and find acceptable substitutes when something becomes unavailable. And sometimes it's available, but with an 8-week lead time, and you have to install it in 2 weeks, and you can't do it. You have to substitute. In those cases, you can't hold up the entire building because of, you know, the toilet compartments or something. That's one way in which we like to sort of serve as a resource during the construction phase, because again, when you work on a number of projects, you almost deal with every, you know, extenuating circumstance that you can think of. And so we learned where to find the appropriately low VOC adhesive for the insulation pins that are attached to the ductwork. I mean, all those like, who would have thought about that, right? But we know, you know, we have now at our fingertips a few products that meet that requirement. And so you learn you collect information by experience. So, you know, one of the things we did have in mind a bit was the operations and maintenance during the lead NC process. I mentioned a green housekeeping innovation credit. We also had an innovation credit related to user education. Those sort of things kind of connected the design and construction to the overall operations. And when you're thinking long-term and energy savings, you know, you're trying to do what's right for the building over time. Because all of this comes down to, you know, are the building engineers going to stay working on the building? Is the property manager? I mean, it all depends on who succeeds the people who have been so deeply involved in the lead process, because there needs to be a continuous passing on of information and a continuous training of staff. And that's actually part of Lead EB, is how do you make sure that the staff are properly trained over time to maintain the building green, because it all comes down to the people managing it. One of the reasons for doing it in the first place was it was another lease requirement, actually. It really was a pretty seamless effort to get started on that. We actually did some initial feasibility for that in 2006. I think before we even completed the Lead NC process, we were already starting to think ahead as to what would be necessary for the Lead EB process, and then we really kicked that off in 2007 and completed it, including the certification in 2008. And that was another case, by the way, where the lease required a silver level EB certification, and we were able to achieve gold. So everybody, you know, that met everybody's goals. The version of EB we were using was version 2.0. Now we're on to EBOM and a couple of different iterations of EBOM, 2008, and we're now into 2009. But the version 2.0 did have a certain amount of overlap with LEED NC credits, but not as much as you would have thought. And so it was surprising to me a little bit how much reinvention of documentation had to be done for that submittal. And so I would say that knowing the building as well as we did through the LEED NC process was a huge help, because we've also done LEED EB on projects where we had no involvement in the building before that, so that, you know, we have to sort of learn about the building. Here we didn't have to learn about the building, but the requirements, even for things that had been thoroughly vetted during the process, for example, we did earn in LEED NC an innovation credit for the green housekeeping plan that was developed. But we had to really revise some of that plan substantially for all the level of detail required by the LEED EB credits, because that's broken out into several different credits that address housekeeping products, equipment, practices, etc. And it helped clarify what some of the monitoring of the systems would be, and you know, we developed checklists for that sort of thing, and trying to figure out what the right level, the right frequency of monitoring of the bicycle storage or the filter changing, etc. So definitely it was very helpful, and will continue to be over the life of the building, at least over the life of the lease, but certainly I would hope over the life of the building. It was not a perfect transition, and it was more labor intensive than I think we set out for, or the property manager set out for. I mean, that's one of our biggest lessons learned about EB, but I would say more specifically version 2.0 is how much work that can be for the property manager. And LEED EB gets you into things like integrated pest management that LEED NC does not. It gets you into much more depth with housekeeping. It gets you involved in purchasing, for example, of paper products. And so those are the sorts of things that you then start to have to understand how the processes work through the property management system, and who's responsible for purchasing what. Now, in this building, or in this pair of buildings, everything that's, you know, EPA space related, everything that's building related, not you know, office paper, whatever, but building related, all crosses the desk of the same person ultimately, so it can be a relatively centralized process. But we've also worked with LEED EB on multi-tenant buildings. We've done some initial LEED EB consulting on the Pentagon when they were exploring the pilot program of LEED EB. And the more different people you have responsible for their little corner of facilities management and purchasing, the more crazy it becomes to track, because you're having to coordinate not with the one person, but with dozens of people potentially. And it's a challenge in those two circumstances, very large institutional buildings or any kind of multi-tenant building. It's very difficult to keep it all coordinated. We worked intimately with the commissioning consultant, the energy consultant, the building engineer, et cetera, on the energy side of things. But as I mentioned, we have a lot of architects, and I myself am an architect, and we got less involved in the sort of the mechanical systems performance, because that was what their role was on the team. But we got more involved with policy, review. In some cases, we drafted some things that were for approval. In other cases, things were drafted that we reviewed. I mean, it's not up to us to dictate building policy, but we reviewed for, is this meeting every requirement of that LEED credit? And we found that the LEED EB credits indeed did have a greater level of detail and expectation on these policies and the monitoring of accomplishment of the policies and all that than we kind of anticipated in the beginning. So that was a good learning process for us. And so that's really the main way in which we've been involved, but we've also been involved with some sort of ad hoc issues. For example, recently with a tenant space that is going into Potomac Yard, they have a certain number of computers, a higher level of computers than usual in an office space. And so we were hired separately to make sure that the energy use of that set of computers was not going to exceed or compromise either the LEED EB criteria or the Energy Star certification that the building has. So that was a separate exercise in itself, and we are sometimes called upon with purchasing decisions that have to be made, whether it's about furniture or whether it's about building materials that need to be in place, just to have an extra assurance that it's going to be sort of, meeting all of the criteria that this building has. Since LEED consulting is a lot of what I and my company do, we have a lot of experience where project teams get a bit fixated on the points, and is the point the LEED point, or is the point the environmental performance that results, from the strategy? So we've seen that in this project, but I can't say that that's unique to this project. That's always the case, and so you always try to come back to what is the overall environmental intent of this credit, and are we doing gymnastics to try to get a point, or are we trying to focus on the least expensive points, least first cost? And I mean, that's something that I think as LEED is evolving, it's getting easier to get away from that, because you're getting into more rigorous environmental issues, but it's always going to be there, and it doesn't throw me at this point. I think it's getting better, because I think the market and the industry is getting more mature, and so it's less of a novelty to have a LEED scorecard in front of you, and people are making more long-term decisions, but I cannot by any means say that that's everyone making long-term decisions. It's interesting to see LEED is in such great use throughout the federal government. It'll be interesting to see whether the standards sort of get absorbed into LEED over time, or whether they continue to have a separate set of environmental criteria. I mean, ultimately, having too many different standards, especially on the same project, can be problematic. And in fact, as we already know, this project used both LEED NC and LEED EB, but those were not concurrent exercises. One of the possibilities during the process was that Building 1, which is fully leased by the EPA, did use LEED NC, but Building 2, which was only partially leased by the EPA, could have used LEED for core and shell, which had just come out as a pilot at that time, and then requiring the tenant space to be separately done as LEED CI, which was completing its pilot stage at that time. And that would have been 3 concurrent rating systems in use on the project. And I advocated at the time for keeping it simple and doing it all LEED NC, and ultimately that was the decision that was made. Because that would have meant 3 different types of tracking and 3 different, perhaps even 3 different sets of I think we would have all gone crazy. However, that said, there is certainly the possibility for LEED CI space and projects being done in the remainder of Building 2 moving forward. And I know that as they try to lease the remaining floors, that's definitely a consideration, is will these projects not only have to meet all the standards set by the rest of the building, including by the LEED EB generated policies, but will they in fact pursue LEED CI certification? And if it's a federal tenant, there's a greater likelihood that it will. So that remains to be seen, but I believe that at this time there's still 30% of Building 2 that's unleased. Part of what was necessary for the submission of Building 2, because there were slight differences between the 2 buildings since we decided to break them out into separate projects, and Building 2 having leasable space, we had to put all of the green building considerations into a tenant guideline document. And so that was actually part of the submission for Building 2. And a lot of credits, the success of a lot of credits revolved around that. I think it makes perfect sense for, especially if it's another federal government tenant, to be co-located in a building that, where the whole story of the building is about LEED and other green building, accomplishments, really. I mean, from the perspective of, I mentioned previously, the federal government's GSA's Greenlease program, I think of it myself as a Greenlease success story, because the SFO requirements and the lease, sort of carrot drove this speculative building from being a relatively light shade of green with the certain things that they were already doing to a much deeper shade of green. And it caught it just in time, although it would have been easier for everyone if it had started before, earlier on in the design process, but it was caught just in time to make a number of changes that really improve the environmental performance. And so, the tenant's happy, the building owner's happy, everybody's happy. I started working on this project, I think it was the summer of 2003. So, that's more than 6 years ago, and LEED already has evolved in a number of significant ways, and I have yet to wrap my full brain around LEED version 2009 of anything, because we're still working on so many projects that used prior systems. And so I honestly am hard-pressed to think of a way in which it needs to evolve that it hasn't already evolved. If it hadn't evolved, then I would have a lot to say. But USGBC has already thought about a lot of those things already because they've gotten all the sort of feedback that they could from dozens and dozens and hundreds in some cases of certified projects of each type. So now, we're in a new era of continuous improvement, and I think that's where we need to be. I really can't think of anything that I would change about, I'd say, LEED NC version 2.2 or LEED version 3, the whole 2009 suite of LEED rating systems. I tried to think about that, and I just can't come up with anything. In the DC market, I mentioned before, it's relatively mature because it has a sort of a legacy by now of a lot of government requirements and government incentives. So it's sort of the different, and I don't just mean federal, I mean state and local as well, have been both driver and example. So they've led in both ways. And so the Washington, D.C. area has a lot of architects, a lot of even development professionals, certainly engineers and contractors who have become LEED accredited professionals themselves, and by now maybe are working on their 4th or 5th or even more LEED projects. So there is a fluency that many people have. Now the flip side of that is there is almost an expectation that everybody knows LEED really well. And it's impossible to know LEED really well without doing LEED in any substantial quantity. And so we always stay ahead of the curve by keeping up with the latest and being sort of able to work on a variety of different project types and different LEED products and that sort of thing. Whereas, a firm might have a number of architects who have worked on kind of one type. And that's helpful and that's very good, but that's a limited, knowledge base. And then when they have to do something completely different, it throws them. Now, we have done also a certain amount of training over the years, and so there are a number of LEED accredited professionals out there who learned about LEED through us, and that's a great thing to see. It comes to the question about at what point does the LEED accredited or the LEED consultant, I'd say, who's a standalone entity, become phased out? And I try to answer that question for myself all the time because I don't really think it's one answer. I think there are certain, sort of basic LEED projects that can sometimes be done without a LEED consultant, but it takes that committed personnel on staff, and that's often the missing piece is that, you're a LEED AP, so you can do all this other stuff too. Well, that, just doubled their job description. So I think what we are seeing is that the market is driving us to be more advanced level, to work on more complex, multifaceted projects, and to really be sort of, leaders in the field as opposed to, kind of working on the path that's already been laid by other people. But I will say, on the flip side, as far as markets, my headquarters is in Richmond, Virginia, and the Central Virginia area is one market that isn't nearly as fully developed as far as LEED knowledge and LEED and completed LEED projects. We've worked on almost every one that has been completed or is in process right now. And so I would say that, depending on the geographic region and what the drivers are, such as the presence or absence of federal government, the role can still be sometimes inclusive of the more rudimentary services. So I was astonished in the DC area to see as much contribution to the sort of LEED pool by the private sector. I've talked a lot about government as example and government as driver. The driver has to do with incentive programs, but even in the absence of incentive programs, there's quite a number of commercial developers here that have been adopting LEED as sort of standard practice for multifamily buildings, office buildings, etc. I think that is less the case in the Richmond area. That kind of thinking of, a LEED certified or silver level should be a standard for a Class A office building. That's really a statement that's almost universal around here, but that's not at all the case in Central Virginia. So in that area, we have a certain presence of the state government, the Commonwealth headquarters of different things. And so we have a lot of state level activity, a little bit of county activity, a little bit of city of Richmond, et cetera, but it's not nearly as much contributed to by the private sector. Not yet, but we're trying to change that. It's subtle, but there are sort of methodologies for communication that I developed over time, trying to figure out what's the best way, especially with a large team as this was, to keep everybody on the same page. And so certain means of communicating action items. People are very task-oriented in the sort of design and construction process, as they should be, because things have a deadline. And I think that giving people clear deadlines and sort of giving them ways in which to narrow down their focus, even though you want to be integrated, right? But integrated doesn't get your tasks done. So everybody needs sort of a short list of, bottom line, here's what I need to do by when, otherwise I'm going to be holding someone up. So that sort of project management aspect of the thing is something that I would say evolved. And, this project would have been very different had I and LEED been involved from the early stages of design. Who knows what we could have done differently had we been starting with a blank slate. But of course that wasn't the case. So it was constantly an exercise of figuring out how far you could push the envelope within reality. And reality is you cannot affect the schedule any more than it's already been affected. You cannot affect cost any more than it's already been affected. You can't come up with some brilliant, innovative technology 50% through construction because nobody's going to want to hear from you. So you have to, figure out what's realistic and go from there. I would say one thing about communication on the project is that in the beginning, with this large team and the tenant being on one side of the table and the developer on another and all of the associated team members, it was very formal in the beginning, and I mentioned that there were lawyers involved in communicating to each other. And the LEED process is not a legal process. Certainly LEED was part of the lease, and that was a contract requirement. It was very important that it be done. But once we all sort of established a bit more of a trust level and a spirit of collaboration, and information was starting to be shared a little bit more freely, backup documentation and that sort of thing, I think the process became more fluid in a good way. It was more smooth at that point. It became a little more normal, I would say, because in the very beginning there were just a lot of people in suits staring at each other at opposite sides of the table.